There are griefs so deep they carve out the landscape of a man's soul, leaving behind a terrain as barren and broken as the dust-choked plains he calls home. Elias Thorne was such a man, and his heart was such a place. The wind that scoured the cracked earth around his homestead was the same hollow breath that sighed through the empty rooms of his life, a constant, mournful reminder of the wife and child the fever had stolen from him. Silence had become his only companion, a heavy blanket woven from memory and dust. It settled in the corners of the cabin, clung to the faded gingham curtains his Sarah had hung, and filled the space at the dinner table where laughter once lived. He moved through his days like a ghost, his hands performing the rote tasks of survival without conscious thought, his eyes fixed on a horizon that promised nothing but another merciless sunrise. The land itself seemed to be dying with him. The well grew fickle, the fences sagged like weary shoulders, and a patch of earth by the porch, once a riot of Sarah's marigolds and thyme, was now a scar of pale, lifeless dirt. He was a sentinel guarding a tomb, a protector with nothing left to protect, waiting for the same unforgiving earth that had claimed his family to finally claim him too. He had forgotten the language of hope, and the sound of his own voice was a foreign country he had no desire to visit. This was the state of Elias Thorne when cruelty, dressed in the guise of a cruel joke, came riding up his long, neglected driveway. The rumble of an engine was a violation of the sacred quiet, a grating intrusion that pulled Elias from his reverie on the porch steps. A dusty truck, coughing black smoke, clawed its way up the path, and inside were three men from town he knew by their reputation for casual malice. Jed Barlow was at the wheel, his face flushed with cheap whiskey and the mean-spirited glee of a man who found sport in the suffering of others. They spilled out of the truck, their laughter coarse and loud in the fragile air, and pulled a fourth figure from the back. It was a woman, small and slight, with hair as black as a raven's wing and eyes that held a universe of silent endurance. Her hands were bound in front of her, and a rope was tied loosely around her neck, the other end held by Barlow as if she were livestock. "Thorne!" Barlow bellowed, his voice a hammer blow against the silence. "Heard you were lonely out here. We brought you some company." His companion snickered, their eyes crawling over the woman with a dehumanizing calculus. She did not flinch. She simply stood, a pillar of stillness in the swirling dust, her gaze fixed on something beyond them, beyond this place. Elias said nothing, his face a mask of granite. He felt a familiar, deadening weight settle in his gut. He just wanted them gone. He wanted the silence back. "She's a mail-order bride," Barlow sneered, yanking the rope. "Fresh off the boat from China. Don't speak a lick of English. Bought and paid for, but the fella who ordered her skipped town. So, we figured, who's got more empty space than old Thorne? A gift. From us to you." It was a joke, layered with contempt for him and for her. They were mocking his grief, his isolation, and her otherness all in one vile gesture. They shoved her forward, and she stumbled but did not fall. They tossed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle at her feet. Then, their sport concluded, they clambered back into their truck, laughing as they spun tires in the dirt and disappeared in a shroud of their own making. Elias was left standing on his porch, the dust settling around the silent woman who was now, impossibly, his to deal with. She was not a person to him then. She was just the punctuation mark on the long, cruel sentence of his life. In the days that followed, the woman moved through his house with the quiet, unobtrusive grace of a shadow. He had given her the small spare room, the one that had been meant for a nursery, and laid out a blanket and a pillow. He left food on the kitchen table for her, a piece of bread, a bowl of stew, which would be gone when he returned, the bowl washed and placed neatly by the sink. They did not speak. They did not even make eye contact. He felt her presence as a constant, low-grade hum of obligation, another chore in a life of endless, meaningless chores. He would watch her from the corner of his eye as he sat on the porch, staring at the dead garden. She would stand in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the dim interior, just watching the land. She had a stillness about her he had only ever seen in wild creatures, a state of perpetual, wary observation. After 3 days of this suffocating silence, she did something that broke the pattern. She walked to the barren patch of earth by the porch, knelt, and began to work. With her bare hands, she started pulling the hardiest weeds and picking out the sharp, flinty stones, placing them in a small, neat pile. She worked for hours under the oppressive sun, her movements deliberate and tireless. Elias watched, a flicker of something, annoyance? Curiosity stirring in the ashes of his heart. He saw the raw, scraped skin of her palms and felt a distant echo of an emotion he couldn't name. The next morning, he left a pair of his late wife's gardening gloves and a rusty trowel on the porch railing. When he returned that evening, the tools were back in their place, cleaned of all dirt, and the patch of cleared earth had grown by several feet. The gloves remained untouched. A week bled into another. The strange, silent rhythm of their cohabitation continued, marked only by the sun's relentless journey across the sky and the slow, steady reclamation of the dead garden. The woman, he still didn't even know her name, had managed to turn over a significant patch of the rock-hard soil. She used water sparingly from the rain barrel, carrying it in an old bucket, her thin arms straining with the effort. Still, he kept his distance. To acknowledge her was to acknowledge the cruelty that had brought her here, to acknowledge the world beyond the borders of his own grief. It was a world he had no strength for. But the past was not as dead as he liked to believe. Tucked away in a drawer was a small metal box containing the few things he'd kept from his time in the war. One evening, driven by an impulse he didn't understand, he opened it. Inside were his dog tags, a faded photograph of his unit, and a small, worn leather-bound journal. As he sifted through the memories, he found the crumpled document Ballo had thrown into the dirt that first day. He had stuffed it in a pocket and forgotten about it. He smoothed it out on the table under the dim yellow glow of the oil lamp. It was a bill of sale, a crude and horrifying receipt for a human life, filled with characters he couldn't read. But at the bottom, scrawled in simple, phonetic English, was a name. He took the paper and walked to the door of her room, hesitating before he knocked. She opened it, her face impassive. He held out the paper, pointing to the writing. For the first time, he spoke to her, his voice a rusty croak. "Is this you?" She looked at the paper, then back at him. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then, she took a piece of charcoal from the hearth and, on a spare bit of wood, she wrote 2 characters. Beneath them, in careful, blocky English letters, she wrote her name, Son Mei. The world stopped. The name, Son, was not just a name. It was an echo from a lifetime ago, a ghost from the blood-soaked hills of Korea. Sergeant Sun, a man who had laughed in the face of death, who had shared his meager rations, who had dragged a young, wounded Elias out of a firefight, shielding him with his own body. A man who had died in his arms, whispering about his wife and a daughter he'd never met, a daughter named Mai. "If you ever see them," he had gasped, his last words a sacred plea, "tell them I loved them." Elias stared at the name written on the wood, and the ice that had encased his heart for 2 long years began to crack. The name was a key, unlocking a part of him he thought had been buried forever. The promise he had made to a dying man, a debt of honor he never believed he could repay, was now living under his own roof. Sun Mai was no longer a shadow, a burden, or a cruel joke. She was the daughter of the man who had saved his life. She was a sacred duty. The world shifted on its axis. When he looked at her now, he saw not a stranger, but the ghost of his friend in her determined jaw, in the quiet strength of her gaze. His movements, once heavy with lethargy, now had a quiet purpose. The next morning, he didn't just leave tools, he sharpened the spade and oiled the mechanism on the well pump to make drawing water easier. He ran a new line from the rain barrel directly to the garden plot, a small act of engineering that spoke volumes more than words ever could. He started leaving a second cup of coffee on the table in the mornings. He didn't know if she drank it, but he left it all the same. Mai watched these changes with her usual guarded stillness, but a subtle shift occurred in her as well. She began to meet his gaze for a fleeting second before looking away. One afternoon, as he was mending a fence post, she approached him and offered him a bowl of water, a silent gesture of gratitude. He took it, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against hers, and in that brief contact, a fragile bridge was built across the chasm of their silence. A few days later, a miracle occurred in the garden. Amidst the dark, cultivated soil, a tiny spear of green had pushed its way toward the sun. It was just a single, impossibly small sprout, but to Elias, it looked like a banner of victory. He found himself standing over it for a long time, the sight of this new life stirring a feeling so alien and so profound it took his breath away. It was hope. The single green sprout was soon joined by others, a tenacious little army conquering the barren ground. With the shared, unspoken purpose of the garden, the silence between Elias and me began to change its texture. It was no longer the empty, aching silence of grief, but a companionable quiet, rich with understanding. Communication became a language of gesture and action. He showed her how to properly handle his old, gentle mare, guiding her small hands on the leather reins, the horse responding to her soft touch with a surprising calm. In return, she began to transform the meager contents of his pantry. Using the first tender leaves from her garden and the wild herbs she gathered from the hills, she cooked meals that tasted of a world he'd never known, the unfamiliar spices a quiet rebellion against the blandness his life had become. They ate at the same table now, the empty chair no longer a gaping wound but simply a space between two people. One evening, she laid out several smooth, flat stones she had collected from the creek bed. Using her charcoal stick, she began to draw characters, then point to objects, table, cup, bread, and say the words in her language, then wait for him to supply the English equivalent. It became their nightly ritual. His rusty voice grew stronger as he taught her words like water, sun, and grow. She was a fast learner, her voice soft and melodic as she repeated the foreign sounds. A quiet respect grew between them, a mutual appreciation for the resilience they saw in each other. He saw a woman who had survived the unimaginable with her dignity intact, and she, in turn, began to see past the broken shell of a man to the bedrock of honor and kindness that lay beneath. The warm glow of the lamp in the evenings pushed back the vast, lonely darkness outside, creating a small, safe island for two survivors in a sea of desolation. The turning point came not with a word, but with a shared crisis. The old mare, his last living link to the life he'd had with Sarah, fell ill. Elias found her one morning lying in the paddock, her breathing shallow, her body trembling. A wave of cold panic, a dread he hadn't felt since the fever came, washed over him. He worked frantically, covering her with blankets and trying to force water between her lips, but she was fading. He sank to his knees, the familiar specter of helplessness wrapping its cold arms around him. He was losing again. But this time, he was not alone. Mai was suddenly there beside him, her face etched with a fierce concentration. She laid a hand on the mare's neck, speaking to it in soft, cooing tones. She ran back to the house and returned with a poultice of crushed herbs from her garden, which she gently applied to the horse's gums. All through the day and into the long, cold night, they kept vigil together. They moved as a team, their actions synchronized without a single spoken command. He held the mare's head while she spooned a thin, herbal broth into its mouth. Their hands brushed in the darkness, and for a moment, they held each other's gaze over the flickering light of the lantern. In that look, they saw a shared determination, a refusal to surrender to the darkness. Toward dawn, the mare's trembling ceased. Her breathing deepened. She lifted her head and let out a soft nicker. She was going to live. A profound, bone-deep relief washed over Elias, so potent it felt like a physical release. He looked at Mai, her face smudged with dirt and exhaustion in the pale morning light, and he saw not just Sergeant Sun's daughter, but a partner. The garden, now a lush and vibrant testament to her care, seemed to glow in the sunrise. And as he watched a small smile touch her lips, Elias felt an answering smile, his first in years, rise from a place deep within him. He was no longer just surviving. He was beginning to live. But peace, in a world that contained men like Jed Barlow, was a fragile commodity. The story of the Chinese bride had become a sordid piece of town gossip, and Barlow, hearing that his cruel joke had not broken Elias but had instead brought a semblance of life back to the dead homestead, felt his pride wounded. Malice, once it takes root, is a hard weed to kill. He saw the quiet respect some of the townsfolk were beginning to show Elias, the way they'd nod at him instead of looking away. He saw the basket of fresh vegetables Elias had traded for flour and salt at the general store. Barlow's joke had been turned against him, and his resentment festered. The sky itself seemed to mirror the growing tension. For a week, the air grew thick and heavy, the horizon stained a bruised purple. The winds picked up, carrying the scent of rain and something more, something threatening. Elias felt it in his bones, an old soldier's instinct for impending conflict. He watched the horizon not for rain clouds, but for the dust cloud of a truck. He spent an afternoon in the barn, not mending tack, but carefully cleaning and oiling the rifle he hadn't touched in 2 years. He moved with a grim efficiency, the motions familiar and sure. The protector, dormant for so long, was now fully awake. He was no longer guarding a grave, he was guarding a home. He was guarding my. That evening, as the first drops of rain began to fall, he saw her standing by the now flourishing garden, securing a delicate vine to a stake before the wind could snap it. Her devotion to this small patch of life was absolute. And in that moment, his was to her. The first crack of thunder split the sky, and in the distance, he saw the telltale glare of approaching headlights. The storm was here. The truck skidded to a halt in the muddy yard, its headlights cutting through the sheeting rain like malevolent eyes. Barlow and his 2 cronies stumbled out, reeking of whiskey and emboldened by the storm's fury. "Thorne!" Barlow roared over the wind, his voice slurring. "We came to collect our property. The joke's over. We got a new buyer for her, one who'll appreciate her proper." They advanced on the cabin, their shapes monstrous in the flashes of lightning. Elias stepped onto the porch, the old rifle held loosely in his hands. He was no longer the hunched, hollowed-out man they remembered. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, his face a mask of cold resolve. Behind him, in the warm light of the doorway, stood Mai. She was not cowering. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her eyes fixed on him with an unwavering trust. "She's not property," Elias said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the howl of the wind. "And this is her home. Now get off my land." Barlow laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Look at him." Playing house with our gift, he lunged for the porch steps, but stopped short as Elias raised the rifle, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud between thunderclaps. The fight that followed was not a drawn-out battle. It was a thing of brutal, primal efficiency. One of the men charged, and Elias met him not with a bullet, but with the rifle's stock, a swift, hard blow that sent the man sprawling into the mud. The second came at him with a knife, and Elias moved with a speed and ferocity that shocked them all, disarming him and throwing him back into the deluge. Barlow, enraged, pulled a pistol. But he was drunk and slow. Elias was sober and driven by a righteous fury that had been years in the making. He fired once. Not at Barlow, but at the ground just beside his feet, the shot erupting with a deafening crack. The explosion of mud and stone was enough. Terror finally pierced Barlow's drunken rage. He scrambled backward, dragging his groaning men with him. They piled into the truck and fled into the storm, vanquished not just by a man with a rifle, but by a man with something to lose again. When the last echo of the truck's engine was swallowed by the storm, Elias slowly lowered the rifle. The rain continued to fall, but its fury was spent, softening now to a cleansing downpour. He turned and saw Mai still standing in the doorway, her silhouette haloed by the warm lamplight. She hadn't moved. Her eyes, wide and luminous, were locked on his. The violence of the last few minutes seemed to hang in the air between them, an ozone charge, before the gentle rain washed it away. He walked back onto the porch, placing the rifle against the wall. He was breathing heavily, not from exertion, but from the sheer, cathartic release of it all. He had faced down the ugliness of the world and had not broken. He had protected his home. He had honored his promise. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived. By dawn, the sky was scrubbed clean, a pale, hopeful blue. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. Elias and Mai stood together on the porch, watching the sun rise. The garden was untouched, its green leaves beaded with rainwater, sparkling like 1,000 tiny jewels in the morning light. The world felt quiet, peaceful, and full of possibility. He looked at her, at the quiet strength that had weathered every storm thrown at her, the strength that had, in turn, saved him. He had to give her a choice, an anchor. He had to say the words that would transform a debt of honor into a bond of belonging. He finally spoke, his voice clear and sure in the morning stillness, free of the rust of grief. He said her full name, a sound of profound respect. Sunmai, he said, looking directly into her eyes. This is your home. If you choose to stay. She didn't answer with words. She simply looked at his outstretched hand, then placed her own in it. It was a pact. A beginning. And so, we see how a seed of kindness, planted in the most barren of soils, can grow into something strong and beautiful enough to hold the world together. We see that a promise made in the shadow of death can find its fulfillment in the light of a new day. The story of Elias and Mai is not just a story of two people finding solace in a desolate land. It is a testament to the enduring power of honor, the quiet courage of resilience, and the profound, transformative nature of compassion. It reminds us that our deepest wounds often create the very spaces where new life can take root. We are all, in our own ways, tending to a garden. Sometimes it is a plot of earth, more often, it is the landscape of our own hearts, or the hearts of those we encounter. There will always be cruelties, large and small, that seek to trample what is beautiful, that seek to turn human beings into objects of scorn or sport. But the choice is always ours. We can let the ground lie fallow, surrendering to the droughts of grief and the frosts of bitterness. Or we can choose to pick up a tool, to clear the stones, to offer a cup of water, to protect the first tender sprout from the harsh wind. The greatest acts of love are often the quietest, a shared meal, a mended fence, a name spoken with respect. These are the things that chase away the darkness. In a world so often loud with hatred and division, remember the silent language of decency. Remember that every person you meet is the child of someone, a keeper of stories you cannot imagine. Be the one who sees the person, not the label. Be the one who honors the promise. For it is in nurturing life, in all its fragile and unexpected forms, that we truly find our own way home.